Hi, my name is Nia. I'm the president of Lawyers Without Borders Student Division at the University of Aberdeen. Basically, we are a subdivision of the bigger Lawyers Without Borders organization, and as such stand for the same goals, namely access to justice, human rights, and the rule of law. I know it says lawyers in the title. You can join if you're not a law student. Don't be put off by that. You can join if you're not a law student. A member of our committee is not a law student. Do not be put off by that. We have two divisions, an events division and a research division. The research division conducts legal research for different NGOs and writes reports. That did have an application process, which is unfortunately closed. However, you are still very welcome to join our events division, which plans everything from socials to academic talks and conferences. We hold a pretty big human rights conference every year in the spring, which you can also help organize, which is very fun and exciting, as well as academic talks and more like fun socials. We are having one of our first socials as like a more informal social for Halloween on the 28th, I believe, 28th of October at 7:30. So everything is on our Facebook page, so come find us on Facebook, find us on Instagram, email us, shoot us messages, someone will answer.
Amnesty International is a human rights organization that both, I guess, supports a human, well, it does like human rights oversight, and it supports human rights lawyers and advocates in different countries. They have their own campaigns as well that basically seek to bring different human rights issues to light, and also to basically get people involved. We as a society, we have different events. We also do events like focusing on civic issues. One of our intro events was a discussion on the Aegean island and the refugee congestion there.
Hi everyone, so as Jamie said, I'm Fiyin, and I am the equity officer on council this year. And equity is basically to make sure everyone is respectful, nobody feels offended, or nobody, has issue with what's been said. But if you do, I'm going to post the equity form in the chat, in the Zoom chat today, and you can anonymously send a quick message in there just to discuss what you felt uncomfortable about, and we'll try and resolve it. Tonight should be a great debate, so I'm looking forward to it, and thank you very much for listening to that.
All right, thank you very much for that, Fiyin. Just a reminder that everything said tonight may not be the view of the person who is speaking it. Some people are arguing against their own opinions tonight. Right, so should we move on to the debate? This House supports the processing of refugees overseas. There'll be 4 speakers aside. So on the first side of proposition for this House supports the processing of refugees overseas is Ethan, and we'll go from when you're ready.
Okay, good. Good evening, all. As I said, I'll be speaking. I'll be the first speaker speaking for the motion. Now, of course, the first disclaimer I suppose I have to make is that this is not about being, anti-immigration. Of course, Britain has a long and proud history of taking refugees, and indeed we have a moral responsibility. And of course, I believe it was the 2015 Cameron announced 20,000, and I think clearly that was the right thing to do. Perhaps we should have taken more. But absolutely, I want to be very clear that this is not about being anti-immigration in the slightest. Clearly, they add value to the economy. This is simply about how we go about processing large numbers of refugees, which, of course, as I said, we have a moral obligation to do. So the first kind of starting point I'd like to go is in terms of normal immigration applications, right? It's normally done overseas. So normally, if you're from another country, of course, it's done through the embassy. It's normal. It's normal to have visa applications done overseas, right? Now, of course, it's a different process for refugees, but the fundamental principle of can you process, immigration from abroad, practically speaking, clearly it can be done. It's being done by every country in the world. Now, of course, I'm sure the opposition will will talk about how they're, of course, coming from, very dangerous war-torn areas and, extreme poverty and, persecution, etc., etc. And of course, that's all true. But the vast majority of these people, in terms of the debate about who we're in terms of this, if what this debate is sort of focused on are immigrants or are refugees and asylum seekers who are already in Europe, and therefore the argument that they're fleeing persecution and war and so on is very true, but it doesn't apply to people living in France. Now, of course, it's they're not living in nice conditions, and of course, clearly, the international community should be doing more for them. But they are in a safe country. If you're a refugee from Syria or an asylum seeker from anywhere in the Middle East, you're in France, you're in Germany, and so on, or you're in Calais, you're living in a safe area. So then the next point I'd like to make in terms of the process, I completely acknowledge the process could be quicker in terms of the refugee asylum, but as I said, it's very practical doing it abroad. And another point I'd like to make is in terms of on international agreements. So as I said, the first main point I was making was that it's practical, they're in safe countries. But the third main point I'd make is in terms of international agreements, there's plenty of international agreements that already exist in terms of processing refugees abroad. And of course, for example, it's a bit more complicated. It's a bit too complicated to go into, but for example, the EU has the Dublin Agreement in terms of processing refugees and trying to find a way that works, within the international rule system. And so I suppose I've been rather brief there. A final point I'd make is in terms of the infrastructure. Sorry, I'm not taking points. Not yet. I'll take a point at the end if we've got time. The final point I'd like to make is in terms of infrastructure. Clearly, we've already got a housing crisis. We've already got, we're already not in an ideal situation to be taking mass numbers of immigrants and refugees and processing them here, and therefore simply both from an infrastructure perspective, from a practical perspective, it's perfectly normal, it's perfectly ordinary, it's perfectly possible to process refugees overseas in a perfectly humane and civil way, of course, as they're already in safe countries. Can I take the point of information, or is it too? No worries. Thank you for your time, and I beg you to propose the motion.
Right, thank you very much, Ethan, for the opening speech of tonight. Now, the first speech in opposition to the motion is George. So, George, you're ready. We'll start with you.
Wonderful. Okay, setting off now. I'm very glad to have proposed this motion, and I would hope that this table and the whole of the House do oppose it. I want to show the House how Britain has a moral right to accept, welcome, and settle these refugees. I'll also go on to demonstrate how that whole. Philosophers better than I can debate whether we should do the moral thing because it merely is the right thing or because it ultimately benefits us, but I just want to show us that by welcoming and settling refugees in Britain, it does benefit us. To start with some rebuttal, my opposite number never actually illustrated why or how we have a moral duty to accept these refugees, which I will do. He then seemed to have some confusion about whether these refugees who were processed in Calais he never said, would proposition want them to remain in France or would they then be welcome in Britain? Definition, which my opposite number did not do, we need to first define refugee. What is a refugee? Who is a refugee? Determines how often we treat them. My opposite number seemed to mix his language, saying that he was in support of immigration in a debate about refugees. A refugee is not an immigrant. Modern political parlance has somehow replaced the asylum seeker because we suspect it makes it easier for successive governments to harden their hearts. No, thank you. If you define somebody as a seeker or as a scrounger, as some would have it, that implies these refugees do not have a right to sanctuary within the UK. No, side opposition believe that historical precedent in Britain we have set over the centuries, from the Huguenots to the Kindertransport, those who are fleeing violence, persecution, and ethnic cleansing, they have a right of refuge in this country. Second definition that the opposition want to delineate is what we mean by overseas. In the context of this debate and the Home Office policy session which it sparked, side opposition consider overseas to be the islands of St. Helena and St. John Island. These are two of the three islands which make up the British overseas territory of St. Helena, Ascension, and Tristan da Cunha. British overseas territories are not part of the United Kingdom. Rather, they are scattered remnants of the empire, having devolved administrations and are self-governing. So in processing refugees overseas on St. Helena and or on Ascension Island, side proposition would be removing refugees from the United Kingdom without trial or independent oversight. These islands do not have the capacity or space to process such numbers, populations of 4,500 and 800 respectively, and so some kind of facility would need to be constructed to house, and let's be honest, imprison these refugees. Moreover, in a world of borders and barriers, walls, fences, and caged children, we need to remember that the concentration camp is a uniquely British invention. The systematic concentration, of refugees in such camp came to prominence during the Second Boer War. The camps, filled by Boer civilians fleeing the army's scorched earth tactics, were overcrowded, inadequate for human habitation or nutrition, and were hotspots of contagious diseases. I wonder how that is relevant in this day and age. It's one of the few times that Britain has failed to stand up for the rights and dignity of refugees, and we must stand against it because it's happening again. A heartless, cruel, conservative government obsessed with, and I quote, splendid isolation. Those are the words of the Tory Prime Minister at the time, Lord Salisbury. I want to highlight how the purpose of this motion would be to transport thousands of refugees who have travelled thousands of miles across the Med, across field and fen to reach Britain, often on foot, often under their own steam, paying out of their life savings to smugglers and people traffickers. And that's where we need to remember, those who make it to Britain are those who have money enough to afford to flee, to afford to pay the smugglers. Those who don't have such income are left with no way out. The refugees who make it here are middle classes of places like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, or places where the UK intervened, destabilised the country, and continue fuel the war today by selling arms. Surely these professionally educated doctors, nurses, lawyers, university professors, surely these refugees should be welcome here, not only because we have a moral duty to accept them, but also because they can play a beneficial and constructive role to our society. Those opposite would most likely complain about the impact of refugees on job services and the economy, but they cannot deny that we have a serious need for more teachers, doctors, and nurses. It's been shown time and time again that refugees play a positive role on our schools and our NHS and are a net benefit to the economy. The United Kingdom has such a dearth of doctors, especially in rural areas. So going down across the border, the NHS's own figures showing that England is all alone short of 10,000 medics of all professions. So if we allow refugees to remain in our country, if we allow them to serve and work in the NHS, then we have more doctors, we have a fully staffed NHS, and we can bring mortality rate down. More doctors, less death, I think that's a positive for side opposition. Coming on to teachers, numbers have fallen by 7% since the Great Recession, and teachers are more likely ever to quit than before. 4 in 10 NQTs leave in the first 5 years of their career. Again, we need to accept these the professionally educated doctors, nurses, professors, teachers, and we can have them staff our schools and NHS. Coming on to universities, the workload and consequent stress of university academics is no secret. YouGov found that more than 40 academics are considered jacking it in. We can offer these places as appropriate to refugee academics. As I said, we have times in Britain's history where we have shamed ourselves in our treatment of refugees, such as in the Boer War, but also been times, more often than not, where we have done the right thing, where we have the courage to stand up for compassion and justice, such as with Kinder Transport, 10,000 children saved. Let now not be one of those times. Let us not shame ourselves, but do right by our convictions. For that reason, and reason my colleague further down the table will explain and send upon, I'm proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for the first opposition speech of the night. We now move on to Derek, who will be giving a proposition speech. So we'll give you 5 minutes starting from when you're ready. Yeah.
Over the course of the pandemic, most international travel has had to stop because countries are rightly concerned about the transmission of the virus around the world. But even during that time, we still saw migrant crossings using dinghies and entering the country at a time when people were supposed to be quarantining for 2 weeks. So I think if we're going to process migrant refugee applications in Britain, then that does run the risk of potential coronavirus infection spreading into the country at this particular time. And we don't know for certain if all these people are being quarantined for that 2-week period of time. But on a more general point, if we're going to process asylum claims in Britain, then we do need to have a plan to house the migrants who come to seek asylum. Now, what we've seen over the summer is when the hotels were closed, the migrants were housed there, and these were paid for by government contractors such as Serco, and a lot of money was changing hands at this and going into private pockets. at a time when it could have been spent on healthcare or on public services. Now, we've seen hotels such as the Hilton, the Mercure, Ibis, which would normally cost at least £50 per night. No, I'm not going to take that at the moment. I need to get through what I'm saying. But they're getting their accommodation along with meal provision paid for by the taxpayer. Now, we're in a situation where British people who are homeless, all of whom will have paid taxes to this country, but are not eligible to be put up in a hotel and have free meals provided for them. I think we need to look at the housing situation in Britain. We were successful in getting homeless people off the streets during the pandemic, and we need to look at ways of doing that on a permanent basis. But I think we need to get that sorted out before inviting large groups of people to come and be accommodated in Britain. Also, there's problems with community cohesion. When the migrants are put up in hotels, it's very secretive, and a lot of people in the local community feel intimidated by having large groups of young men wandering around the streets, and in some cases, a very small minority of cases, but we have seen criminal incidents, such as in Glasgow. Now, we also have the problem of exploitation and the black market economy in Britain. Many of the migrants who arrive will end up working illegally and in appalling conditions because they're not allowed to work while their applications are being processed. Now, that's not something I'm saying I agree with necessarily, but it would be a byproduct if the rules don't change of processing applications here in Britain. Now, we're already seeing the inhumane treatment of migrant workers in the United Kingdom, and I don't think that's something the majority of the public would want to see. I'll take Jack's point of information.
Well, okay. So surely the use of surely the use of things, particularly when, like, for example, the Glasgow incident, these weren't people whose applications were being processed. These were people whose applications had already been processed. They had already been settled, but there wasn't any housing for them to actually go to once their applications had been processed. So surely that's a housing issue rather than a refugee issue.
If we're going to be processing asylum applications in Britain, then we will need to find housing for refugees. So the point remains. And another thing I would say is that the Dublin Convention also says that refugees must seek asylum in the first safe country in which they arrive. Now, there are plenty of safer countries around the areas where refugees normally flee, and I'm saying that their applications can be processed there if they're applying for applications in Britain. For instance, in places such as Turkey and Greece, or Saudi Arabia, or safer countries around war zones such as Syria and Iraq. But the point is, by coming here, they're already going through several safe countries, and it's turning into a large-scale economic migration. So in summary, I do think we have a duty to help migrants, but I would think that we should be processing their applications overseas. So I would ask you to propose the motion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek, for that speech. So moving on to the second opposition speech of the night, which is Johanne, for 5 minutes on opposing the motion, this House supports the processing of refugees overseas. So, Johanne.
Okay, thank you. This is the first time that I'm ever at a debater event, so apologies if I'm not accustomed to how the lay of the land. Well, first of all, I think some of the previous points made were really good. I think some of the points that were made were overly focusing on whether or not refugees are a contribution to the UK's economy or to just the general state of the UK, which I think, is a good point to make, but also, I guess the issue we're discussing here is whether or not they should process on or offshore. So, like George said, basically the idea that was discussed by the UK Parliament recently was whether or not they should be processed on the islands of the greater, like the old UK Empire, which is not actually part of onshore but is offshore processing. The issue about what the Parliament has been discussing is also that actually they haven't really said much about what their plans are, and I must say that I think that it remains, I hope I hope it remains just that, a terrible idea. So for the sake of the discussion, seeing as the UK hasn't specified, I'm going to draw on some issues that have come up during Australia's offshore processing system in terms of the human relations and problems of oversight and displacement of responsibility. Another good point to make about one of the points that were mentioned before as to the offshore processing is the idea that offshore processing is already happening. But I think what the Parliament discussed was whether or not refugees arriving at UK borders should be processed somewhere else when they arrive there. So that is basically the argument that I'm making, or the foundation upon which I'm making my argument. Sorry. So first of all, yeah, Australia's offshore processing system, I don't know how many of you are familiar with how they did things, basically. But I'm going to argue against the idea of offshore processing based on the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees from 1951 and its 1967 protocol. So according to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So, and refugees are entitled to human rights, which includes freedom of movement, freedom to not be arbitrarily detained, access to the courts, right to primary education, and work, among others. Many of these human rights are not being adhered to right now. The UN Convention of 1951 on the Status of Refugees establishes that states are bound by the principles of non-discrimination, non-penalization, and non-refoulement. This means that states are obliged to ensure protection for refugees, to not punish them for seeking asylum, and to ensure that they are not returned to any country where their life or freedom would be threatened on account of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. The problem, of course, with this, and as we've discussed a little bit, is that states are not legally bound to accept refugees and grant asylum, so it is a state-to-state basis. And I think this is also a good point to make, because when we talk about whether or not, you know, refugees are already processed overseas, and you made the point that, for example, some of the refugees that come to Britain are processed in France, it is upon an agreement between France and Britain that they are processed there. It's not because they're processed overseas. It is I think it's an issue of basically like you said, some of the European states have agreements among each other where on and how refugees are dispersed, basically. So it is not an offshore processing system. That was my point. This also means that, for example, because states are not legally bound to accept or grant asylum to refugees are already extremely vulnerable. So offshore processing seems to me just another attempt to displace responsibility and make the conditions and lives of the refugees less visible to the public. Sorry, yeah, okay, thank you. This has very much been the case in the Australia's policy of offshore processing. Their use of offshore processing was basically a way to deter refugees from coming to Australia, and it worked. And I think that that is also the UK's incentive to considering this approach, is basically to use it as a punishment so that refugees are deterred from coming to the UK. Yeah, okay, I only have 1 minute left, I'm sorry. Okay. So, and the idea of basically using offshore processing as a deterrent is against the principle of non-penalization, which is a part of the UN Convention on the Rights of Refugees, because it is a human right to seek asylum against persecution. And I truly believe that if there's something we need, it is for states to take more responsibility in dealing with the refugee crisis and not less. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johanne, for that speech. Now we move back onto proposition for Gavin, who will give 5-minute speech proposing the motion. So say when you're ready.
Ready now, Jamie? Fantastic. So thank you very much to everyone else who's contributed to tonight's debate. I want to just mention a couple of brief points of rebuttal. Just briefly, I know the Australian system was mentioned. I think on this side of the House, we would completely reject the Australian system. It was completely unfair, and it's not a system that we would accept. And under the proposed motion, if it were proposed, we would not accept that system on the basis that it does treat refugees unfairly. I do want to mention there was a point between Derek and Jack in relation to the incident in Glasgow, and I would say that the point on our side still stands, mainly because had that application been processed overseas or in another country, then had it then, as we say, it was a successful application, the housing would not have been sorted until that person had moved into the United Kingdom. So yes, it would have been, an equally bad situation, and the individual would have had an equally bad time. However, the housing which would have been sorted would not have been an issue, because when they came into the United Kingdom, that would then not have been a point. I will take George's point there as a brief POI.
Thank you. So you say you reject the Australian system, even though this is what Priti Patel is basing the idea upon. So what mechanism would PROP actually set out for processing refugees overseas? Because you haven't set out on that yet.
Well, we would absolutely. If somebody comes into a country to apply to seek asylum in said country, we would say that should be done in another country, in another area. So we accept the notion that it is done in one of these British overseas territories. But more broadly, what I'm speaking about, and in the last 5 years, we've had this massive issue of European migration, Middle Eastern migration. What we're talking about is large scales of people who are moving in. So I'm trying to make a more broad point there, which is to say that yes, we accept what Priti Patel said, but we also accept that it's a lot more complex, and it would be quite ridiculous of us to simplify our argument by going along those lines. I want to make a bit of headway on what I'm talking about here in my argument. So I think we really need to focus on the level of state institutions, right? So in this country, the NHS before coronavirus had suffered immensely, right? And we had in 2015 the refugee crisis, which has manifested itself ever since. We had from Angela Merkel the acceptance of over 1 million asylum seekers or refugees, and that was at the time seen as a very good thing. But the fact is that if we're talking about the United Kingdom, it's just not something that we can handle or could have handled at the time, which is why you've seen a lower level of asylum seekers and refugees in the United Kingdom at that time. And it's why, quite frankly, it makes more sense for asylum seeking requests to be processed outside of said country rather than inside said country. I also want to talk about the English Channel. Now we've had, and I'm sure this will be a bit of a contentious issue in this debate, and it's a bad scene to see some people, many of whom have died. But I think if we oppose this motion, then what we really say is we encourage people to come in, whatever it is, by illegitimate means into a country to seek asylum. And that's not something I believe on this side of the house that we can, quite frankly, accept. I don't think that people should come through and try to seek asylum through illegitimate means, because I think it's broadly more dangerous than if they were to do it in another country, be processed in another country, be accepted from that country, and then brought in. It's a much more safer way to do it. I was also, before this debate, I was looking at the issue of the town of Barnsley in England. Now, Barnsley is a very odd town. It's got a massively high number of asylum seekers. It's also got a very high number of people, 70%, I believe, that voted to leave the European Union. So it's a very, I guess, anti-establishment sort of town. And one of the many factors that happened was because of the high levels of asylum seekers. What we would say on this house, if you want to stop that kind of, mass anti-immigration rhetoric, then what you really need to do is allow for a more better asylum system where people can apply for asylum, but it's a much more quick system. So that's what I would say, is we need to focus on the problem of asylum seeking itself and not whether or not they should come into the country before they seek asylum. And I beg you to propose the motion. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Gavin, for that proposition speech. And now we move on to the third opposition speech for the night, which is Naya from Lawyers Without Borders. So we'll start the time when you're ready.
Great, thank you. Firstly, again, let me say, as Johanne said, this is my first debate, so forgive me for any missteps. Firstly, I'd like to address a couple of points raised by the Parliament. Firstly, the Deputy Prime Minister tried to argue that it would be more cost efficient to process refugees abroad than it would be at home. I have to say I do disagree with that. Bringing up the example of Australia again, it has shown that over $240,000 Australian dollars is spent processing refugees overseas, in compared to the $12,000 it is used to process the refugees at home. It is so much more cost efficient, just from a purely economic point of view, to process refugees at home, not to mention the more humane side of it. Additionally, I'd like to call again upon some points raised by the leader of the opposition, who very intelligently stated that the benefit that refugees bring to the UK in the form of trained nurses, trained teachers, trained staff. The Parliament itself mentioned that there's a lack. Through the Corona crisis, we have seen the difficulty in the NHS, and we have seen that the NHS is not fully equipped to handle our needs. Why then are we rejecting people who can strengthen that system, who can strengthen systems that are lacking at home? Additionally, there have been points raised that we have to sort out the problems that we have in the UK first before accepting more people. I would like to say that this is a very privileged point. It's very privileged to be able to have problems such as housing problems instead of war and terror, extreme internal migration, and extreme poverty. These are issues that are so much more fundamental, that attack our human rights so much more than housing problems. The UK is more than equipped to handle refugees, more refugees than we are taking in, frankly. Additionally, the last speech that was given mixed up a lot of terminology. We are talking about refugees here. We are not talking about asylum seekers. Asylum seekers is a completely different category that needs to be dealt with differently. Do not confuse these terms. Please make sure that you're talking about the correct group of people. And frankly, I find it's a bit naive and not correct to mix up these terms, because they are that fundamental. Again, I would like to also thank the deputy of the opposition for refocusing this debate on what it is actually about. It is about where to process refugees once they have arrived in the United Kingdom. We are not talking about the migration crisis. We are not talking about immigration. We are talking about what to do with people who show up in the UK and request to stay here. The reason why these refugees are fleeing their homes is because of the things mentioned before. It is because of war-torn countries. It is because of terror. It is because they are fleeing extreme poverty. These are terms that we do not even know the meaning of in the United Kingdom. The reason why there is extreme poverty, the reason why there is war in countries from which most of the refugees stem from, namely the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. Those regions of the world produce the most refugees because of the impact that the West, namely and especially the United Kingdom, has left. Just looking at the example of Sub-Saharan Africa, the complete mess and disaster that the United Kingdom has left after they invaded Africa and particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, and took all the natural resources, is simply unacceptable. It is you cannot burn your neighbor's house down and then start crying when they come to your door asking for help. This is exactly what we are doing. we cannot turn back our back to refugees because they are seeking help for the problems that we have caused. We need to take responsibility for our own actions. We need to take responsibility for the extraction of natural resources that we have done in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, and we need to take responsibility for the war that we have caused in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Naya, for the third opposition speech tonight. And now we move on to the whip speech for proposition, which is Helen. So Helen will be whipping the side of government for this House supports the processing of refugees overseas. So over to you when you're ready, Helen.
So I'm going to very briefly explain what the job of the whip is in terms of debating role fulfillment, and then I'm going to fulfill that role in 5 minutes. So in a traditional debate, a whip speaker goes through the debate, sums up the different points that were made and weighs them against each other to try and make it more easier for you, the audience, to understand what happened in the debate and, you know, like who won, whose arguments were more impactful. So my job is to rehash the arguments that were said on my side, compare them to other arguments that were said throughout the table, and then kind of try and weigh it for you. Before I do that, though, I'm going to start with a bit of rebuttal. Nia claims that it is more expensive to process refugees overseas, but she draws from an Australian example rather than what we set out in the mechanism of the House. The House's mechanism is in a hypothetical situation where we process refugees from France before bringing them to Britain to begin their life as refugees in this country. This means instead of, as is Australia, which is processing them in an overseas territory that belongs to Australia, an island of its own, this means that costs associated with accommodation, food, lawyers and stuff like that is mitigated because these are already available in the country that they are being processed in. It's just a matter of communication over the channel and making sure that the resources get to where they have to be. So I think a lot of the cost discrepancy can be mitigated in that way. The second thing is, I'll actually, you know what, I'll integrate it. I'll do it on the fly. It's fun. Okay. So, what have we heard from the proposition, from the opposition tonight? Sorry, forgot which side I was on. So we've talked about moral need to sort of accept refugees, refugees who are coming to this country. I mean, after all, like, we fucked up the entire world, and therefore we have a responsibility to, you know, help people rebuild themselves. I accept that this is true, but I think that as the actor of the state, it's our responsibility to look after our own people as well. George is making a face at me. Please don't judge me, George. This is a debate. I have to say these things. Yeah, so we have a responsibility to look after our own citizens first and foremost, because our citizens are the ones who pay taxes. Our state is currently lacking in things such as housing, schools. POI, yes. I'll finish my point and then I will take it. It's currently lacking in these things. And until there is time for us to recover from coronavirus and build up wealth, you would have a situation where everyone is getting less, and people in British society who are not receiving enough will continue to not receive enough, when I think most people would agree that the moral duty of the state is to make sure that its own citizens are looked after. So in the midst of the recession, it's important to prioritize our own citizens and the ones we've accepted, rather than people who are working through their refugee application, because very well these people might be removed from the country. I'll take the POI.
Sorry, did you say that Australia did the offshore processing on their own islands? Was that what you said?
Yes, I did.
Okay, well, so they did it in Papua New Guinea, so they didn't do it on it was offshore processing in a different country to the detriment of Papua New Guinea, and basically Papua New Guinea on the island in question chose to close the camp down because of human rights abuses and because nobody took responsibility for what was happening there. So that was just my point.
Yeah. The difference between the Australian model and the proposed UK model is also one of political power and political pressure. So France is a country that is just as powerful politically as the United Kingdom. It's also one that ascribes more human rights laws as the United Kingdom. So if you are a refugee who wants to make sure human rights are protected, personally, I would choose somewhere in continental Europe and not the UK. That's just my opinion. The point is the power discrepancy that existed between Australia and Papua New Guinea, where the camp was, wouldn't exist because France and the UK are equal players. And if France notices human rights abuses, it is significantly more likely to be able to produce political sanctions against them. And yeah, my final point is refugees being processed in France could come to their senses and realize that the UK is a trash country to try and get to and leave, which would be significantly harder if they were in the UK. And that is my speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for whipping side proposition, Helen. And for the final table speech of the night before we move on to the floor speeches will be Fiyin. So whenever you're ready, Fiyin, we'll begin the timer.
Okay, so everyone can hear me, right? Fantastic. Let's get to it. Okay, so first of all, Helen's already kind of gone over what the whip does, so I won't reiterate what she said. Basically, I'm going to tell you actually how the debate has gone tonight and why our side of the house clearly has taken it on the side of, we've clearly explained to you who is coming over, we've explained to you the value that they're bringing, we've explained to you the fact that like they're not also going to be a burden on our nation. I think that's something that our side has tackled very well. There's been this idea that there's this overwhelming amount of, there's been confusion. Like in Naya's speech, she dealt with the fact that the other side have been confusing who are migrants, who are refugees, who are asylum seekers. They've just taken one look at the photo that was like with the motion and decided what they think the actor looks like, which is completely wrong, as we said on our side. So basically, first of all, let's get it straight. The UK is not bearing the brunt of receiving refugees, because our side has mostly talked about refugees, so I'm going to go with them as our main actor. We haven't received the brunt. It's mostly been Turkey, it's mostly been Lebanon, and if we're even going to go to continental Europe, it's mostly been like Germany and France. So any idea that like, oh, the UK is somehow being overwhelmed and the UK is going to get corona through like people coming across the ocean, that's completely like not true. And our side of the house have shown you that. And in fact, we've even gone further to like define who is coming over. In George's speech, he clearly said to you, these people, middle class, these people are skilled, these people are coming to add value to our nation when we need it the most. These people are coming here not because they want to reap the nation of its resources, but because they can actually add value, and we need to let them do that. And we think that like, I think this debate has been very much focused, it's been kind of a bit difficult to draft because we've not really been talking about the processes, but we've basically said that when these people come over here, there was a discussion on the other side of, oh, we don't have the infrastructure or it's inhumane here or something like that. But our side of the house has reiterated that when you remove how we deal with refugees, when you remove how we deal with these people who are coming from war-torn countries, then you are removing them from the public eye. You're letting a lack of transparency enter that process. Why? Because then if we shove these people onto the like British island territories that like our side has talked about, that means the public is going to be less aware of like what's happening there, what's going on, and are less likely to intervene when the government is acting inappropriately, which given the government we have right now is very highly likely. So our side of the house has shown you how we need to ensure that like if we're talking specifically about like refugees, when they're coming over, it's within an infrastructure that we can see, one that's transparent, and one that like we have a moral right to provide for them. And that's one thing that we've talked about a lot on our side of the house, which I think is like kind of our winning point, right? Like it's like taking responsibility. We've had like the speakers before me have talked about the different things and the different ways in which the UK as a nation has intervened in other countries, had an impact there, and the history that it has in terms of causing these mass migration of people. And we've basically talked about this is us, we needed to build an inland structure where we're taking responsibility. And it's not like we're taking responsibility and like we're basically getting people back on their feet. And we're also not just getting people who are just coming from nowhere, because there was this argument that, they should do it in their country, but then they started talking, like the other side started talking about how the countries are war torn, but they should do it in their country. So clearly those countries have no infrastructure to do any kind of inland, processing of like refugee applications. So they need to do it here. Our job is to build up an infrastructure that's able to take these people in. Most of them aren't even coming, like, again, we're not bearing the brunt of this. We really aren't. So we have the space, we have the capacity, we have the resources to be able to do that. So it's up to us to actually develop our infrastructure, not throw it away on some island and hide it from the public, so the public, isn't able to see what's going on. And I think on one side, one speaker on the other side also mentioned something like, oh, like people started voting to leave the EU when like they had a mass influx of migrants, which again, their side confusing all these different terms. Well, we say like, okay, we all accept that like Brexit was a manipulation of the voter group, right? A lot of people were fed false information during Brexit. And so what we think is that like, when you now decide that you're going to shift, it's like you're kind of distracting the voters from the key problem. You're distracting them from the fact that the current system is inhumane. You're just going to shove it on some island, and then that's going to have a further impact on those people who live in those British island territories. You're just kind of shoving whatever issues we have here onto them. So that doesn't help us in any way. And then there was this idea that, oh, if we do some work with France, because we're on the same level, France will like be able to deal with it. Well, again, France bearing the brunt, we need to be able to improve our infrastructure. And our side of the house is one today because we've talked about taking responsibility, and we've talked about the fact that these people are coming here to add value, not take away from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fiyin, for concluding the side of opposition to the motion. Now that is the table speeches. Now we move on to the floor. So these are 3-minute shorter speeches on side proposition, opposition, or abstention. Abstention is either for or against, or just a comment about the debate overall. So should we see if anyone wants to speak on the proposition side? This House supports the processing of refugees overseas. If you turn your camera on or raise your hand or write in the chat bar to give a 3-minute speech. If not, move on to opposition to the motion. Oh, is there someone there? Adam Taylor. Yeah, Adam, sure. If you want to turn your camera and microphone on, and we'll give you 3 minutes and a 1 minute left. That's all right.
Hi there. Thanks very much. I hope everyone can hear me and see me properly. I just have a very quick point to make. Obviously, it's been talked about the distinction that really needs to be made between economic migrants and genuine refugees, and it's a distinction that frankly the left often fails to make, because Britain, as has been said, has a long and proud history of accepting genuine refugees, and as far as I'm concerned, long may this continue. But the people coming, risking their lives, coming over on the boats from Calais every day are arriving here illegally, and they are not refugees, they are economic migrants. They are arriving here illegally if they are trying to seek asylum, because as has been stated, international law is quite clear that if you are seeking asylum, you must do so in the first safe country you arrive in. And if they're coming from France, well, that's already at least one safe country. Goodness knows how many more safe countries they've already come through, traveling through Europe and the Mediterranean. Right now, there are so many people coming across that we're housing them in the UK in army barracks, and yes, I think, quite frankly, prison-like situations. So it's not only more humane, but more in line with international law to house people and process them in adequate accommodation, even if that means in some rock in the Atlantic like Ascension Island and such like. So this would also hopefully deter people from making these treacherous journeys that they do to reach Britain, and thus it would actually save lives. And also, I'd like to quickly make the point that the argument that somehow that Britain has caused this influx of refugees by our own foreign policy objectives over the past centuries is so ignorant of history that it beggars belief, quite frankly. So I'd urge you all to propose this motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam, for the first floor speech of the evening. We have Amaya, who would like to give a floor speech in opposition. So Amaya, if you turn your camera and microphone on, and we'll start the time when you're ready.
Hello. I would prefer doing it without camera. Perfect. Okay. I would like to say that thank you for the speakers. I enjoyed the debate first, and then I would like to say that the debate about and the narrative about illegal immigration, there is no illegal refugees and there is no illegal asylum seekers. Their status is protected in international law, and the UK also has made some illegal, I guess, or at least very objectionable rules about how families can be reunited, and it is one of the things that I think is one of the deterrents parts of the UK legislation about people that need to come back to their families, that they are not allowing it. So I guess, yeah, the people that complain about large groups of young men in their neighborhoods, I guess in Spain, I am from Spain, and it also happens. There is young people that arrive unaccompanied, and they don't have the right to bring their families over because there is rules against that. So I think, in general, the UK's position is quite a mean one against other humans that don't that the voting population doesn't consider their problem or their I don't know, human others. Yeah, I think it's a pity that the UK accepts the cruelty that happens to other people as not their own problem. Yeah, sorry, that's all of my speech.
Thank you very much, Amaya, for the first opposition speech of the night. Opposition floor speech of the night. Now we move on to abstention. This is either a for or against, or just a general comment on the process of tonight's debate. So if anyone wants to give a short abstention speech, speak now, or we'll go for round 2 of proposition opposition. Okay. No, so we go back to proposition. So anyone want to give a short floor speech proposing the motion? This House supports the processing of refugees overseas. If not, we'll do an opposition again, abstention again, and then move on to voting. So move on to opposition. Anybody? No? Okay. Abstention again. Okay. Right, well then we'll move on to the vote for the evening. Okay, so the way we vote is I will call out proposition, and everyone who supports the side of the motion will put their hands up right in the side of the chat or do a reaction on their screen. And Matthew and I here won't vote, but we will count them. And then we will do opposition, and if you're an abstention, don't say anything, don't message, and it'll count as an abstention. Right, so we'll move on to proposition side. So all those in favour of proposition for the motion, this House supports the processing of refugees overseas, please raise their hands, message in the chat, whatever now. So thank you. Thank you very much for proposition and opposition. For those opposing the motion, this House supports the processing of refugees overseas. Raise your hands now. You can write in the side chat as well. Everybody, I believe. Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. That's all right, Gavin, we saw you. All right, thank you very much. Tell you what, I'll read out the results for tonight. So in proposition to the motion, you have to make a note. So in proposition to the motion were 5 votes, and in opposition they are 11. So the opposition win the day. This House does not support the processing of refugees overseas. Thank you very much to Lawyers Without Borders and Amnesty at Aberdeen for this collab and for the great speeches tonight. Hope to see you all either next week or at training with Maxwell, competition with Helen. So Gavin, when you're ready to share your screen. So the motion for the 29th is this House would re-elect Donald Trump. I'll read that again. This House would re-elect Donald Trump is the motion. The final debate before the vote, this will be on the 29th, with the actual election being on the 3rd of November. Until then, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for that, Gavin. I'll see you all around, and thank you very much for this week's debate.